Welcome to Module 9 of the TOGAF 9.2 e-learning course. This module is on architecture governance. Governance is going to be a big part of preliminary phase, as we discussed in the previous module on the preliminary phase. Also, of course, very big in phase G, implementation governance, but there's governance throughout the architecture development method. So we want to cover architecture governance writ large, the components that make up the architecture governance framework, then look at architecture governance in practice, what's the business case for architectural governance, and what are some guidelines for establishing an EA capability that incorporates governance. So governance is the practice by which enterprise architectures are managed and controlled. This includes controls on the creation and monitoring of components and activities. That's looking at the introduction, implementation, and evolution of architectures. Also, it's about ensuring compliance. It's about supporting management and accountability. So we set up governance initially in the preliminary phase in the form of the architecture governance framework, and it has to fit in light of our overall governance environment. Part of setting up and managing governance, of course, is having an architecture board, and that's usually the owner of the architecture practice. Compliance to the ADM is actually fundamental to the governance of the overall architecture practice. So there needs to be some, again, control, monitoring, discipline. And a big part of governance also is decision making, ties to decision making, who gets to make what decisions and so forth. And that's a big part of architecture overall. And governance helps with that whole discipline. So governance, I mentioned, is a big player in preliminary and phase G, but also is actually in phase H because H is responsible, phase H, for executing governance. So governance ensures that business is conducted properly. It's about effective and equitable usage of resources to ensure sustainability of strategic objectives. There are some basic principles of corporate governance where you focus on the rights, roles, and equitable treatment of your shareholders in a publicly traded or even private organization. It's about disclosure and transparency, and it's about accountability. Responsibilities of the board are reviewing and guiding the corporate strategy in the private sector, and about setting and monitoring the management's performance objectives. So governance is the system by which business corporations are directed and controlled. So we're talking about governance in the big sense here. And this is some information that has come from benchmarking. And you can see here some important points. The corporate governance structure talks about the rights and responsibilities of the different participants, lays out rules and procedures for decision making, also provides structure and process for monitoring performance. So besides corporate governance, we have technology governance, IT governance, and architecture governance. And we can also look at how we're governing with global representation, regional representation, and local representation. So we don't have a framework per se for technology governance, but we do have one in best practices for IT governance. It's called COBIT, which stands for Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology. And it's an open standard by the IT Governance Institute. So it does provide some management guidelines, maturity models, critical success factors, key goal indicators, and key performance indicators as well. So it can help to control and measure IT resources and overall IT governance. So the TOGAF standard acknowledges the role that COBIT can play for the IT part of governance. So the architecture governance framework is set up in the preliminary phase, but we have implementation governance as a subset of that in phase G. That's where we are realizing the architecture through change projects. But architecture governance covers management and control of all aspects of the development and evolution of enterprise architectures. The AGF, the Architecture Governance Framework, is generic and can be adapted to an existing governance environment. Basically, looks for use cases where responsibilities can be elucidated, communicated, and managed. These are some of the use cases on the left in the red: policy management and take-on, compliance, dispensation, monitoring and reporting, business control, environment management. Environment management being like the continuity of communications as you move, let's say, product from one part of the organization to another. And what are those handoffs, and how are you making sure that they're made properly? Then you have your content here, including service level agreements and operational level agreements. You have a process flow control, and then you have record keeping in the repository. So architecture governance framework is an approach that's provided within TOGAF that involves various processes in the context of the organization and lays out responsibilities using certain information and record keeping to ensure the integrity and effectiveness of architectures. So we want to use this framework in a way that allows for flexibility, to allow for adjusting processes and adding new information as appropriate. The architectural governance framework is fundamental also to the enterprise continuum, which is our overall term for a knowledge base for doing architecture. And the AGF manages all content for both the architecture and the architecture governance processes. The structure for the governance environment is often set up under the CIO, CTO, reporting to an architecture board, and then you have your value streams of developing, implementing, and deploying architecture supported by the knowledge base, the enterprise continuum, with this information, of course, being stored in an architecture repository. Enterprise continuum being a way to classify the information, architecture repository being the physical instantiation for actually making the knowledge available as information to support the value streams. So again, we see the emphasis on management and control of architectures, and we need structure to do that. And some of the structure we see here: global governance board, local governance board, design authorities, working groups or parties. And then we have to consider the value benefits of architecture governance. So we see how important it is to link processes, resources, and information to organizational strategies and objectives. It's important for integrating and institutionalizing leading slash best practices. It's important for aligning to industry frameworks. It's also very important for taking full advantage of assets within the enterprise and for protecting the underlying digital assets of the organization, supporting regulatory and best practice requirements, and promoting visible risk management. Key success factors include the use cases that we saw earlier under process, submission, adoption, reuse, reporting, retirement of policies as appropriate, procedures, roles, skills, structures, support services. So organizational responsibilities and structures are also important to support governance in terms of processes and reporting requirements. We also have tools and processes to procedurally and culturally promote take-up of the governance guidelines and approaches, management of criteria to control architecture governance processes, dispensations or waivers, compliance assessments, service level agreements, operational level agreements, and also to meet requirements for effectiveness, efficiency, confidentiality, etc. here. So a way to measure, for example, a workflow or a product. So speaking of structure, a very, very important aspect of that is the architecture board, which oversees implementation of the governance strategy, and in fact, in my view, owns the architecture practice. So is comprised of representative stakeholders responsible for review and maintenance of architecture, both locally and globally, with clear responsibilities and decision-making capabilities, and also clarity about where it has authority in what domains. There's value to having a board, and there needs to be value because it does take time to to commit to the meetings and so forth. So if you have a board, then you should be able to prevent one-off solutions and unconstrained developments. If you have those, of course, that could drive up costs, lower quality, increase risk, and complicate the reuse of your solutions. So boards need to be looking at ways that the architecture practice is in fact increasing efficiency and effectiveness. The board has many responsibilities. Of course, it's very important for decision making regarding the overall setup and evolution of the architectures, looking at consistency between the sub-architectures as we look at the different domains, business data, application, technology, and perhaps even security. We should be targeting reuse as a metric, and also looking for flexibility, because as a business changes, architecture also needs to align to those changes. And also, the architecture should be judged on how well it's leveraging new technologies. So the board should be looking for that as well. So the board is also there to enforce architecture compliance and to check how the architecture is maturing within the organization and ensure that the discipline involved with architecture is being followed as laid out in the customized framework. And also the board needs to make it clear how to escalate an issue if it's outside the purview of the board. So the operations of the board are important, and TOGAF does provide guidance on this, including how the importance of having well structured and well run meetings. Part of architecture governance would, of course, include architecture contracts. There could be contracts throughout the architecture practice, including perhaps even contracting out the architecture practice. But contracts would be joint agreements between different stakeholders, again, looking at high quality architecture as an outcome. Having architecture contracts, explicit agreements, would help assure continuous monitoring to check integrity, changes, decision making, auditing, would help with the oversight to ensure adherence to principles, standards, and the requirements of existing or developing architectures, would help identify risk, would help ensure a set of processes and practices to ensure accountability, responsibility, and discipline regarding all the architectural work products, and also clarity about the overall governance organization. Well, so again, as I indicated, we could contract out the whole architecture practice or parts of it with statements of architecture work. And statements of architecture work lay out in phase A who's going to do what, by when, for whom, to what degree of quantitative measure, etc. And we are looking at work in the different domains, business data, application technology, and also we could have architecture contracts in phase G where we are looking at what we need to have communicated to the architecture team by the implementation projects. In phase G, architecture governance, or implementation governance, rather, we could be doing compliance reviews where we're trying to ensure conformance of the implementation projects with our architecture specification. So assuming that what we're reviewing is relevant, we can look for varying kinds of consistency and conformance. What we're trying to avoid is non-conformance. So that would be where we appear to have consistency, compliance, conformance, and even fully conformant setup, but where we find, in fact, there's some features that are not aligned with the architecture spec, and that's where we see this rectangle. So again, there could be this varying degrees of overlap, but what we're trying to avoid is nonconformance, and that's where we'd have to look at either changing the spec or changing the implementation approach. So there are two processes defined to ensure compliance of projects within enterprise architecture per the TOGAF standard. We prepare project impact assessments, and we perform architecture compliance reviews. For the compliance reviews, there's a lot of work to do these well, and there should be a roadmap to do them better and better over time. But in fact, one should be reviewing implementation projects on an ongoing basis and not just at particular milestones. But if we looked at compliance reviews at particular milestones, for example, we would still benefit from this list of elements here. We catch errors early. We could ensure that leading practices are being used, that the implementation's being done in compliance to standards that are mandated, unless perhaps those standards need to be modified in some fashion. And we need to look at what some cases may be application specific, but in fact could be looked at more broadly as an enterprise approach as we're reviewing different initiatives. We need to look at how we're going to collaborate, share resources, and build synergies across multiple teams as we do these reviews. We want to be very cognizant of changing business models and technologies. We want to be able to review projects in light of their technical readiness. Perhaps it's a whole new technical approach that's being done, so there'd be higher risk. We need to look at procurement criteria and also be able to identify and communicate significant gaps to various providers that we recognized during the reviews. So in part 6 of TOGAF, we have a whole chapter on architecture compliance. This is from that chapter that shows the different steps that are recommended for doing a compliance review. So we have a request, identify the responsible organization, the lead architect, and then we do discovery to see where this whole system fits overall and what type of change is entailed. We then tailor checklist for the initiative. We'd have a review meeting with the project principals. We'd analyze completed checklist and identify and resolve issues, come up with recommendations. Then the final review report would be developed, and then there would be presentations and reviews more formally, and we would have sign off then or recommendations for rework by the board to the customer and the customer. Ultimately, then we would have a summary of our compliance review. In part 6 of TOGAF, we also have a chapter on establishing an architecture capability which provides guidelines, including the recommendation to use the ADM in order to have more structure and discipline in terms of the decisions that need to be made about your architecture practice, in terms of the way to set up your team, your principles, your modified framework, your tool environment, etc. These are difficult decisions, so use of the ADM cycle would be quite appropriate, and one would have to consider that same usage as you go to mature your practice, looking across the different domains that feed into your EA capability as with any capability. So architecture governance is the practice and orientation by which enterprise architectures and other architectures are managed and controlled at an enterprise-wide level. It includes implementing a system of controls tied to creation and monitoring of all the architecture components and activities. You might think of the structure and behavior to ensure the effective introduction, implementation, and evolution of architectures within the organization. We want to implement a system to ensure compliance and also to support effective management of all our processes. Accountability is a very key part of governance, so that needs to be clear. We need to be accountable to certain stakeholders, both inside and outside the organization. So we should be gathering information, be able to provide appropriate reports based on the monitoring we're doing tied to our governance responsibilities. This concludes the module on architecture governance.